Welcome to the Millennial Dream Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Moore. I'm speaking today with Maia Mindel, economist and blogger. She runs the substack Some Unpleasant Arithmetic and is a contributor for Vox. Great to have you on today.
Hi, yeah, I'm very happy to be here too.
Yeah, so just wanted to, jump in with really how you got started in your publication, but also just your creative pursuits outside of your professional career.
Well, yeah, I started in, I think, 2021, so almost 5 years ago. And I started thinking, at the time I was considering getting into like writing, blogging, that sort of thing, because I felt like I could develop it, develop that skill, which I felt could be useful in my career, but also like in just in my life.
Yes.
And I felt well, I think I have some interesting stuff to say. And if people like it and if people sign up and read it, then I'll keep going. And if it seems to not pay off, I'll give it up and focus on something else. And it's really worked for me. I think I mean obviously it wasn't like an overnight sensation where I got 10,000 followers in 1 week, and I've been coasting off that. It's been like a slow march to where I am, but I feel like I've made it pretty well, and I think that I've managed to keep writing consistently, which I think is the biggest challenge, right? Because I know other people who do some writing or who are interested in it, and what they tell me is that the hardest part is consistency, and it's like being able to keep a steady rate and being able to build up the habit. And fortunately, I've managed to do that. But because I really enjoy writing and I really enjoy reading, which actually, like the real reason I started like writing a blog is that I felt like it made it easier for me to do some readings for school because I was in undergrad at the time, and I felt like I could convince myself to do the readings for labor economics class and for development economics and whatever if I could frame it as like something I was interested in finding out more about, and also like just to have an excuse to read stuff outside of self class of my own, because I felt like I was reading a lot. I enjoy reading very much, and I've always enjoyed it. And I felt like I was reading a lot, especially like nonfiction books and academic articles and stuff like that. But I wasn't really retaining them. And from my time in university, something I also figured out my was that I could retain stuff better if I wrote it down. So my method of studying has always been to like read something and take notes, and then summarize those notes into like a final version. And I realized I could do that, uh, but obviously it wasn't like just to study, right? Because a lot of the stuff was just stuff that I was interested in, and stuff relating to current events and to current topics of discourse. But I always felt like it gave me like a space and a way to think about issues and topics and anything else more clearly and more thoroughly, and to really figure out like what I thought about something and why I thought it.
Fantastic. So it sounds like you use your writing as something I've heard before, essentially essay writing as a form of thinking. Would you say that that's an accurate assessment?
Yeah, yeah. I you need to do the thinking. Like obviously, you need to do the thinking beforehand too, because if you don't really arrive, well, I was gonna say at the page, but it's not really a page. It's like a website. But if you don't really like get there and know what you're thinking and what you want to say and what you want to write about, it gets really, really hard to actually like figure out where you want to go. And I'm writing something right now that's not like super complex. I'm kind of struggling with figuring out how I want to like line up all my arguments.
Hmm.
And so I'm gonna postpone that one for a week or two
Hmm.
until I have a clearer idea of what I want to say and why I want to talk about that. So yeah, I mean, I feel like the thinking part is important, but also like the part about like expressing your ideas is also important, because obviously you can think about something and you can do a lot of thinking, but also like you need to like figure out who you want to be able to read what you're saying and how you want them to like think about what you're saying too. Because something I and the real reason I thought that I like had a shot at, at having a blog with a readership is that um I realized that a lot of blogs in economics there's like a really long history of blogging that where it's considered like somewhat more respectable or like pretty respectable compared to other, fields of study or professions. So I didn't really feel like, so like when someone is like an economics blogger, that's not necessarily like a bad thing, because a lot of important professors, writers, pundits have blogs or have websites or have like a thing on the side where they write.
Yeah, I know.
So
Marginal Revolution, they were pretty
yeah,
early
yeah.
in the blogging game, back in kind of the first generation of blogs.
Yeah, there's been like multiple, like a long history of economics related blogging. So my thinking was like, well, that's going to be something that can, get me in conversation with people who have something to talk about with me. And it has. I mean, I have some like good friends who I met like talking about blogging and stuff like that. And there's also like the thing I sorry, I so, like in economics, there's a really well established like history of blogging. So I didn't think it was going to like really get me, in trouble or like get me taken less seriously if I wanted to pursue like more, like I wasn't really sure if I wanted to go like the academic route, but I
Hmm.
was open to it. So I was like, I mean, like this can get me, this isn't this can get me more information too. And then like I talked with, and then, but I also realized that most blogs in economics are geared towards people who like have an extensive or like a clear background in economics, and that I think makes them like makes the field like really inaccessible, because people like, I mean, here in Argentina, it's just like way more high profile and way more talked about and discussed about. But in the US, like also and internationally, people have an interest in economics and have an interest in economic concepts. And I think the last 5 years have proven that people really, really care and really want to know about inflation, interest rates, and that sort of thing. And even like it's also pretty common for economists to use economic logics and economic concepts to understand like non-economic phenomena, which I have like mixed thoughts about that, but I think that, in the end, it's just about thinking. And and if I'm doing it like in a blog or on Twitter or whatever, then like it's not really the same as what I see as a really harmful tendency in the field to sort of cannibalize, public health or that sort of thing. But like, anyways, going back to I feel like a lot of the writing is designed to like tackle questions that people in general think are interesting and important, but also like things that but also like it's not really in a way that's accessible to people. It's like, I realize that if you want to cite a paper, it's like way easier and it makes it way more engaging if you like link it directly, like in the claim you're making. So if you say, higher interest rates reduce inflation, there's this and that research. Uh, if you put the research at the end, people don't check it. And
Hmm.
also like something even worse is when people just like cite the paper like an academic citation, and it's like, yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna find the Williams 2005 paper.
Yeah, yeah. And with
Yeah.
any online publication, we have the benefit of having hyperlinks in a way that a written and printed paper, needs to be, or an academic paper generally needs to be a bit more flexible. And so the referencing structure for an essay is inherently going to be different than an online publication. But yeah, it's nice to be able to click through and see where people are coming from, where they're pulling the information and bringing it together in some of the writings. And so, looking at some of the stories that you've had that have been more popular recently, you had a recent article about Argentina, the recent election, and Milei. I believe the title was Homo Economicus or Homo Argentum. So, human economists or human Argentina is the translation from Latin.
Yeah, basically. I mean, Homo economicus is like an economic concept.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the most like criticized concepts in economics, which is the idea that people are like rational and that they make decisions by considering a cost and benefit in like a really thorough and a really like structured way, which anyone who's been to a grocery store once knows that's not how people make decisions.
Yeah, there's a bit of the id that is involved in decision making more so than the logic and reason side.
Yeah, of course. So obviously, like that's a pretty idealized notion of how people think. But I think I've defended the idea more than most economists because I think that a lot of the criticisms that accuse economics of oversimplifying reality also oversimplify economics, let's say, because like if you go back to the history of the concept, if you go back to the papers where the idea of rationality and rational expectations come from, which is like fairly new. Well, it's not that new, but it's fairly new. It started in the 60s and it only really became mainstream in the 80s and 90s. And if you look at what they were saying, they weren't really coming from a place of like, this is how people think and this is how people make decisions. This is how people like logically decide. They were thinking about it more in the terms of like, if you look at how the marketplace evolves over time, you are going to find that that like you could argue for like I'm gonna use an analogy for biology here. It's how I got explained in school and how I explained it on my blog, which is that there's a pretty famous story from the Industrial Revolution that there were a group of moths, like insects,
yes,
that were very white, and they were very white because the trees in the area were had like really clear bark. So they would like stick there and not be seen. But then with the Industrial Revolution, it started. They burned cold, so all the trees got like stained dark, and so suddenly the moths that were white started being like really noticeable, and the ones that were darker were very, very well camouflaged. So over time, the color of these insects shifted from very light to very dark. And it would be like insane to say that they decided to change colors, right? But like if you wanted to explain it, if you for some reason felt it was like useful to describe it as the moths decided to change color, then like that would give you the correct like description of of like the color of moths before and after the Industrial Revolution, and after the coal factories all shut down too. So in economics, like the idea of the rational individual is sort of like saying, that natural selection is the survival of the fittest, when it's not really survival of the fittest. It's like it's random, but over time you end up saying like, well, these are the species that were the fittest for this environment. And like the other example that they use, which is a lot less fun and a lot like less informative, is that like if you had a tournament of rock, paper, scissors, like obviously the game is basically chance, but like if you had the entire tournament, you could say like what the ideal strategy is based on like what the people who won did. So like the Homo economicus concept is sort of like this idea that people over time and over large numbers of people, they are going to act in a way that's like statistically this or that, which this is an idea I just had because I was thinking about the topic a lot. And like some of the people who most strongly embrace the idea that the market works like that are also some of the people who are like the least skeptical, the most skeptical of like voting elections democracy. You know, the libertarians, like Brian Kaplan has a book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, which is about how voters like aren't rational. But he's a libertarian. He thinks that consumers are rational.
Yeah.
And like the interesting part is that if you take the notion that elections sort of work like the market, then like you can see how even if like the average person makes decisions based on like who had the most, who got like their favorite celebrity's endorsement or things that aren't completely illogical, the whole of society is going to decide based on like the actual factors that matter. Which is like there's another book called Democracy for Realists, I think. That's sort of like, it's not really clear how they're saying voters work, because they say that voters based on the economy, and then they say they vote based off like blind retrospection, which is just like how everything was over the 40 years. And then sometimes they use like more sophisticated forms of retrospection. And that's because they're trying to like put the assumptions that they're making on individual voters still, and not really on like the electorate as a group. Because if you put it on the electorate as a group, then you say like, well, they didn't like how the president handled the issues of the last 4 years, whatever those issues were. Maybe they felt like the president's party moved too much to the left or to the right, depending on who was in power, or that they didn't do a good job with inflation and with jobs and etc. And so like you don't really need like the one correct thing to understand like what happened. You need like the general gestalt of the election. So Homo economicus is that thing, and Homo Argentum it's a movie. It's a movie that I mentioned this on the vlog, but it's a movie that came out this year. It's the president's favorite movie.
Okay.
He makes his cabinet to watch it with him. And the thing that they say is basically that it's like it's like 16 little stories that are where like the main character is always the same actor, and he's in different costumes. He's a priest, he's a president, he's a businessman, a film director, a journalist, etc. And they sort of show like regular, not really like the whole country of Argentina, just like the city of Buenos Aires, situations, and they sort of like make commentary on, you know, social norms and attitudes. So in one of them, it's like a father who asks his son to move out, and in the end, he's like, "Oh, I miss him." And a lot of the time, it's like it's not really clear what the movie is saying, or like why or whatever. Like for example, there's one where he's a man from a working class neighborhood who, when like houses get broken into, sometimes it becomes big news, and when it becomes big news, there's usually like people from that street talking to the media. And there's always like one old guy who's like, we should kill them. We should all like have guns and shoot them and, you know, kill them when they come. And then that happens, like a bunch of burglars show up in his house, like they tie up his wife and they like leave her in some room locked up. And like he has the gun and he's like, no, don't do anything. Just take whatever you want. And then when he gets his wife out of that room, he says, no, I scared them off with the gun. They could take some stuff, I scared them off. But like most of them don't really have like that depth of commentary. But like the general thread is that like the culture of the country is very like lazy and dishonest and short-term focused and very, you know, sort of like always trying to take advantage of someone else. And he like there is also kind of blame it on like the progressive end of the political spectrum. But regardless of like whether or not that's, accurate or honest, or whether the movie is good or not, it's not very good from what I've heard. Um, I felt like it was kind of an interesting contrast because, like, if you followed like the perfect economic theory, which is what Mirai has been doing until now, you would need like some big changes in his monetary and his currency policy. And if you took like the Homo Argentum view, which is just like let's let's try to get away with it, he wouldn't change it. And what I said is that like if he doesn't really like get serious about making that the hard choice to do that, like I don't think he's going to pull off like his economic program over the next 2 years, because he has 2 years left of his term. And so far that's what's been happening, because like everyone was saying, oh no, they're gonna devalue the currency after the election, and my impression was that like everyone was saying they're gonna devalue soon the entire 2 years he's been in power, and he's never done that. So I mean, there was like a champ in April, but that was like as much as that was what happened, and like it was a very small champ. And so like when people say no, there's gonna be like a big champ in November, in December, in January, in February, there's not going to be a big champ until they can't avoid a champ anymore.
Yeah. And I think to give a bit of context to the audience who may not be familiar with Argentina's economy over time, Argentina's had a long history of difficulty with the currency valuation internationally, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very important price for the economy because, well, first of all, people tend to save money in US dollars because of inflation. It's a really risky bet to say, oh, I'm going to invest in bonds, I'm going to invest in stocks, I'm going to invest in a business, because it's really hard to know how much that's going to be worth in 5, 10, 20 years with the levels of inflation we've had. And, because there's like high and variable inflation, so it's been 50%, 20%, 100%, 200% over the last few years. It's also like really difficult to measure like the prices of important things over time. So if you want to buy a house, it will be completely useless to know that price in local currency. So those operations are also in foreign currency. And the thing about that is that it makes people watch the exchange rate between the peso and the dollar really, really closely. And that means that when the dollar starts moving a lot, people think that that's going to affect prices. And usually it does affect prices. But also they think that it's like reflective of tensions in the economy. So that, it becomes a sign of tension. So the government usually tries to avoid any big movements and tries to avoid like the exchange rate just moving a lot. And something that's been sort of interesting is that it has moved a lot in the last like 3-4 months. So since between April and June it was at around 1,200 per dollar, then it moved to around 1,400, then 1,500, and that it's sort of been in that level since. And that's not really been translated in as like 30-40%. It's been like a 30% devaluation, and there's been like 10% inflation since April.
Yeah.
So that's kind of been a sign that the economically rational route, let's call it, might actually be, worth it, and that the conventional wisdom of the country route is it's a big risk.
Definitely. And, what would you say are some of the origins of the inflation problem that Argentina has had for so many years?
Well, it's kind of like, it's the biggest question in economic discourse. But like the real reason is that the government wants to spend more money that it can bring in as tax revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And so to finance that spending, they order the central bank to create the remainder of the money. This makes inflation high because there's just like too much money in the economy. But also it makes people trust the government. It makes people trust the government less. So they, don't want to loan money to the government. And it makes people trust banks less because they're all like caught up in this. But the real question to ask isn't really like, why is the government doing this? It's really like, why is the government capable of doing it? Because why don't they have more tax revenue? Why isn't the central bank capable of saying no to a president the way that the Federal Reserve so far is able to?
Yeah.
And and that's like that's like a much more complicated story, but for like this generally goes for Latin America as a whole, and I'll get into the Argentina specific one like in a bit. But basically, like, Latin American democracies were like a lot less stable than American democracy or like European democracies because they consolidated much later. So the Latin American independence movement started in the 1810s with France's invasion of Spain. And it took a really long time to like decide on the borders of each country, decide on the relative distribution of power within each country. In Argentina, this process took approximately 50 years, which is, a really long time. And in the United States, it took around 10, for example. And it happened before the 19th century. So so by 1790, I think the US already had a constitution. So what happened there was that so they entered like modernity, so to speak, with a much weaker government and a government that wasn't really capable of doing much. So governments that aren't capable of raising complex taxes like sales tax and income tax tend to finance themselves with tariffs and foreign trade. And the problem with foreign trade is that during the 20th century, it started shrinking dramatically. So you had countries that weren't industrialized because Spain wasn't an industrial country until the 19th century. Until like after most of it had lost most of its Latin American economies, and they didn't really have the institutional and government and political framework to promote big investments like in manufacturing. And also there was like the problem that the ownership of property was really different in Latin America than in the US. In the US, the government gave away lots of land to lots of regular people. So that meant that there was like a big property owning class that could like invest in businesses and invest in those industrial ventures. And in Latin America, it was very concentrated in a few landowners or in a few mining fortunes. And that meant that they didn't really have much of an incentive to invest in industrialization. They had all the money they wanted.
So you have a combination of tariffs as a primary way of fundraising. You have concentration of capital and kind of the resource extraction trap that a lot of developing economies have. And Argentina was on a path that was very strong in the early 20th century, but those factors seems to have moved it into a more marginal position.
Yeah, because Argentina, after it became consolidated as a democracy, which took approximately the first 50 years of the country's existence as a unified political body, let's say, there was like the question of how to organize elections, which weren't, we typically associate voting with free elections, with fair elections, with elections where your vote is secret, and where elections and where everyone can vote.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, suffrage until 1912 was very restricted. Voting was public. Elections weren't really administered the way we administer them now. You would have to like show up and write a list of all the people you wanted to be in Congress or to be president or to be in the electoral college, which made them very unfair. Newspapers would frequently were frequently run by like political families who were, tilting the scale in their own favor. And and there was a lot of bother. For example, landowners would just like make all of their employees sign their names onto like their own ballots.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of gave democracy. So that sort of meant that democracy had like a really weak social basis. Let's say there wasn't like most people weren't used to voting, weren't used to like their vote mattering. So that meant that by the 1930s, when international trade began to shrink a lot and foreign investment began to shrink a lot, the British and later the Americans were investing really heavily in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the Great Depression and the two World Wars, well, the First World War, the second hadn't happened yet, that shrank a lot and the economy entered a pretty severe recession. And so that meant that there was sort of an incentive or like a possibility for the military to step in and take power.
Mm-hmm.
And they did, and they deposed the president, and then there was a whole decade where elections weren't free and were pretty fraudulent again.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is a pattern that's pretty general in Latin America, which is that political institutions were very weak and were very dependent on international trade to fund themselves, and that meant that. And they also like had border disputes with each other that were pretty intense. Argentina until the 80s, like the 1980s, it was we were in a border dispute with Chile about how to draw the border, and that includes like a lot of fresh water and access to the Pacific Ocean, which we lost as part of the decision that we made. So like that meant that the Latin American countries had big militaries. They had like really politically concentrated power because of like the concentration of mining wealth and land wealth and plantation wealth. They had very limited experience with democracy, so there wasn't like a mass constituency that was interested in defending their right to vote. They had basically just gained it, and most people were immigrants anyway, so they like didn't expect to gain it. So that made it possible to have like pretty authoritarian governments and to have governments that were very arbitrary with how they conducted policy, and that meant that investment in like businesses or in the stock market or whatever was pretty risky. Because, the government could step in and say, no, we're going to raise your taxes, or we're going to change all your contracts, or we're going to change this or that. And that made it like very uncertain. So most investments started going into real estate or going into US dollars. And like over time, this meant that the government was comparatively very weak. It was very weak in its capacity to raise taxes, and it was very weak in its capacity to like enforce laws. So that meant that economic informality, that is people who aren't like part of the mainstream economy and instead have like their own world where they don't pay taxes, they don't obey regulations, but they're also not protected by the law. So
yes, because if you have a dispute over, say, you purchase a property with cash, or a business with cash, or you have a vendor relationship that's all cash and off the books to avoid taxes, you have a dispute, then you can't resolve it in the courts because it's all informal and you don't want anything on the record. And then you have, informal enforcement that steps in, usually organized crime, right?
Yeah, that's organized crime or just like social ties. Like informal personal ties.
Yeah, you
But that makes it really
pressure a
hard.
family member, you pressure someone because you
Yeah.
know each other rather than, relying on a court system or relying on any sort of local enforcement.
Yeah, but that makes businesses a lot less efficient and a lot less
Hmm.
competitive because you have to hire people that you have a personal relationship with
Yes.
rather than people who, can grow the business, and you have to bring in your family members for investment instead of like outside people who have the capital.
Yeah.
So that also meant that like the economy that can pay taxes
Hmm.
is a lot smaller
Yes.
than with more capacity from the government.
And
And
that,
this was like a pretty persistent factor until the 80s and 90s, which is when democracy consolidated a lot.
mm-hmm.
Like the government, like the president we had in the 80s, Raul Alfonsín, was very focused on consolidating like a new form of democracy
Mm-hmm.
that people, could sort of like believe in and defend. And he was very unsuccessful at managing the economy, which is what dominated like his time in office. The country entered hyperinflation, so that was a mess. But he also sort of like now is seen as like the guy who managed to get the country out of like the institutional instability trap of the most of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
So he's seen really, really positively now. And then in the 90s, the economy was stabilized with like, all of these big reform packages that reformed the government to be able to spend less money because there were a lot of public companies that were making pretty big losses. There were a lot of like not really social programs.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't really like the case. There was a lot of like subsidized credit, subsidized products, or subsidized services that were really, really expensive and were run really inefficiently.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of that meant cleaning up that side of the equation and also cleaning up the government's ability to resolve all of these broader problems with economic, like the central bank not being able to make monetary policy decisions independently. But the way they resolved that was by making the peso be worth $1. They changed the currency in the 80s and then they changed it back. And the thing about that is that like I think everyone can tell you that the peso, that like one Argentinian peso isn't worth the same as one US dollar.
Yeah.
And the country also had a lot of like it didn't have the same level of inflation. It went down from like 1,000% to 100, then 20, then 10, then basically like normal international levels. But the first 3 years made the currency too valuable for international trade.
Mm-hmm.
So having like an open economy required bringing in lots of international investment. Sort of like a lot of lending in US dollars to companies, a lot of lending in US dollars to households. And that in the late 90s, there started being a lot of, this is what every country in the region and every developing country did to get out of like the 20th century trap, so to speak. The problem is that like Argentina was the only country that made one peso be worth $1 by law. So the problem with that is that like when every other developing country was forced to devalue their currency and to sort of like raise interest rates to stop losing all of that money to stop like needing so much investment. Argentina's needed even more investment. This pushed interest rates really, really high, and that sort of shrunk the economy a lot. And at the same time, the economy became a lot less competitive because, you wanted to buy, because, you paid someone a wage of 100 pesos at a factory. Suddenly that was $100, but like $100 was a lot more than anyone here would be able to pay for that amount of labor. So that also increased unemployment a lot. plus the interest rate impact, and the economy began slowing really, really rapidly in the late 90s. And by 2001, the situation was completely unsustainable. And the government had been successful in securing sort of the support of the US government to get the IMF to support the country. And then because of 9/11, basically, the US government wasn't really... The US government was like, no, we aren't that interested in Latin America anymore. Like, go figure it out. The IMF stopped giving the country money, and sort of that forced abandoning the fixed exchange rate, which was really economically painful because we had to do it basically overnight. And, everyone's wages were in dollars, everyone's prices at the supermarket were in dollars, everyone's like loans and contracts were in dollars, and that it was really chaotic for the economy to sort of have to start over, every economic relationship over.
Argentina entered almost like a dual currency era where the US dollar was the kind of the stable currency, and the Argentine peso acted as the official formal currency. So a lot of informal things entered in, correct? Or is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, by law, the US dollar was like interchangeable with the peso. You couldn't pay taxes in dollars.
Correct.
Which is why...
And it was still a fixed exchange rate.
Yeah, between 1 and 1. But after that, that took away a lot of prestige from economic reforms, because if you consider the fact that, if you look at the number of people who didn't have jobs compared to the population, it was almost a majority of the population in early 2002. The unemployment rate was something like 20%, but that's because, a lot of people were like, the economy's not doing well, I'm not going to get a job, and dropped out of the labor market. If you look at poverty, it was something like 70% at one point. So it was a really difficult year, and that made economic reforms and sort of this centrist or economic ideas that are basic, macroeconomic rational management became really politically toxic, and sort of more these older left-wing ideas about how you can print money and nothing happens and you need to close the economy and everything became a lot more appealing again.
Because the pain of getting the economy unstuck was so high and so unpalatable to the public that, sticking to some of these ideas that were not working, but were keeping things relatively stable, it was where things went.
When people had to vote in 2003, they had been making economic sacrifices for the sake of macroeconomic stability for basically an entire decade. So they weren't very, inclined to sacrificing even more, which is what some candidates in the election back then were proposing. But in the end, it also made people trust the banking system a lot less, because a lot of banks went bankrupt during that process, because one, the government had borrowed a lot of money from them, and that meant that they had really high exposure to a default, and the country defaulted. A lot of people had really high... They had loans that they had, the person who was the 100 peso and $100 salary, he borrowed money that he could pay back when he borrowed $100 for a house or whatever, and then suddenly the $100 he borrowed were worth 400 or 500 pesos, which he couldn't pay. So a lot of banks sort of went bankrupt because their loan portfolios were really exposed to a devaluation. And there was also the problem, and that meant that a lot of people just lost their entire savings when the banks went under. And so the whole thing sort of made the country very hostile to more modern banking, more modern notions of credit, of financial flows. So that meant that the government could only really spend as much money as it raised. And the problem with that is that like the economy lost a lot of steam in 2011, and the country hasn't really like grown economically since, and it's been nearly 15 years. We've just like gained and lost the same 2% of GDP every few years. And so that meant that in the end, you were left with a country that was like a government that wasn't really capable of raising money, wasn't really capable of borrowing money either because of its history of defaulting. And so it was like, I mean, the only thing we can do is we can print money. And so Milei came in and he had like this crazy idea of replacing the peso with the dollar, which he fortunately never did. So when people say, it's funny because people bring up, oh, all of these economists said that he was going to be a bad president. He ended up being a good president. Or like good in the sense that he didn't blow up the economy. But like they were reacting to his campaign promises. It's a bit like the opposite of Trump, where he promised he'd make prices lower, and instead he put in all of these tariffs. And so like this guy was saying, oh, we're gonna close down the central bank, we're gonna like deregulate everything, we're gonna eliminate all government spending, we're gonna like replace the currency with the dollar, and everyone was like rightfully very concerned that it would be that it would be really bad and painful economically. And instead, he basically showed up and did the normal centrist policy reforms. So, like, that was a positive surprise. And the issue there is that, like, obviously, his other policies, he's a very conservative guy. He said a lot of, like, really eyebrow-raising things about a number of things. He had a speech in Davos where he talked about feminism, he talked about gay people adopting children and sort of sexually abusing them, stuff like that. That was sort of like really unpleasant and really unpalatable to me. But I don't think that his economic agenda has been like a mistake. I think that the problem there is that right now we have a very tight monetary policy, so the government can't print any money, which was sort of like his campaign promise, so he can't do that. But at the same time, you need to buy reserves. The country doesn't have any reserves in the central bank. The central bank has $40 billion, and we owe, and like if you take out gold, which you can't count, and if you take out loans from the IMF and from China, and the loan from the US, which like, you know, we haven't really like received the money. We have received like some money. We have 40 billion and we owe 56 billion. So we have negative 16 billion in reserves. And the thing there is that like you need to make the number go up to like be able to preserve the currency over time without that, like a big devaluation. The problem there is obviously that means buying dollars from people, and that means printing money, and the government doesn't want to do that, so it's sort of like stuck there. And so my argument is that like as long as they keep getting big loans from the IMF, big loans from the US, big loans from like there was a program to get people to sort of sell some dollars to the US government or like deposit them in the financial system, and that's sort of with a small penalty. So you could bring in, I don't know, $1 million that you had saved, and you paid like 1% or 5% or 10%, depending on how much, in taxes. And that brought in a bunch of money, and they had like a lot of agricultural sales that they sort of incentivized to get more money. But that's not really like a sustainable way to...
Because ultimately you're going to run out of the informal dollars that are floating around in the economy.
No, there's a lot of them. There's like... Yeah. I don't remember the estimate, but it's at least 200 billion, which is, you know, the country if the country had 200 billion more in reserves, would be like as protected as the strongest currencies in the region. The problem with that is that like, well, it's not really feasible to get those dollars into the financial system, and it's not really feasible to bet on people doing that without like a stronger financial system, without a stronger economy, without like more formality in the economy. So you need like a bigger reform agenda, and you need the right reforms, because like there's been a labor reform being discussed, which I think is undeniable. Like the country hasn't created employment since 2010 or something. Like it hasn't created, full-time registered, all the taxes, all the regulations, employment. Since 2011, it's created a lot of like self-employment, sort of gig work, informal jobs, obviously, but like not really like you are going to pay social security taxes and get a pension, employment.
What industry?
And so that
What?
and
I'm
so
sorry.
like the question is like what reforms you need to do that. And the government is proposing a reform that will allow people to work up to 13 hours a day, which is, not exactly a solution to that problem.
Yeah, increasing the maximum amount of hours per day as part of the normal work day to try to increase economic productivity. It's not necessarily a sustainable strategy. What would you say are the industries that are looking most positive in Argentina right now?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about this because the economy has seemingly recovered really quickly. There was a recession in 2023, a recession in 2024, because of all of these like economic adjustments that he made. And the economy not supposedly, supposedly should grow around 5% this year, which is a good number. It gets it roughly back to where it was in 2017, which is like the highest it's been basically for forever. But like the problem there is that it's not really been even between sectors. The sectors that create the most employment are manufacturing, construction, retail, and personal services. And the sectors that have grown the most are agriculture, mining, oil, gas, energy, that sort of thing, and finance and professional services. And the thing about professional services is that they employ a lot less people than personal services. So there's been sort of like a track in the economy that's very internationally integrated, that's been doing really well, and one that's like more local and more like depends on things like infrastructure spending, on not really tariffs, but like some degree of trade protection, because the peso is like not super competitive internationally, and like these industries sort of need that, and these industries sort of need that extra protection if there's not going to be like, if the currency is going to be strong. And mass consumption has been like a bit weak because wages have like not completely recovered from inflation and from the adjustments of last year. But that's mostly because of like time constraints and like, as I mentioned, that the sectors of the economy that like employ a lot of people like to function haven't really recovered that well. So it's sort of like a bit of a vicious cycle there. And so like I feel like in the short term the model is clearly sustainable, like a model where the sectors that export, the sectors that like are more internationally connected, bring in some reserves, and the peso is sort of strong, and people, like go on vacation and save money and buy cars and whatever. But in the long term, there's going to be like there's going to have to be like a different monetary policy or a different currency policy, because like having the exchange rate where it is right now needs either many more reserves or like a less open economy. And the problem with the less open economy is that like the sectors that are growing depend on an open economy.
Mm-hmm.
So that there's sort of like a very, it's kind of like
Mm-hmm.
you have to commit to like one end or the other end,
Yeah.
like open and with a lot of reserves and with a very high
Mm-hmm.
exchange rate, or closed with a low exchange rate.
Yeah. And now
But you can like sort of be in the middle.
there's almost three exchange rates now, if my understanding is correct. You have the formal for international trade, you have the informal, but you also have the in between, which is foreign credit card transactions. Is that correct? That was more normalized to
Yeah,
the informal number.
there's the formal market, there's the informal market where you go to like usually like a clandestine store and you buy dollars in cash. Well, now you can buy them with like a virtual wallet, so they've like
Mm-hmm.
adapted to the times. And there's like an exchange rate that is like more financial, which is like more embedded in the financial system, because you can buy the bank can sort of like buy and sell the stocks that you need to buy and sell to make the
Mm-hmm.
transaction automatically. But like since the end of last year, the government has been trying to unify all three of them.
Mm-hmm.
And when the IMF like gave us money in April, they gave us $20 billion. The government sort of like got rid of most of the restrictions that were like keeping them separate. So now they're pretty even. There's like something of a difference because like the financial and informal markets are smaller, and there's obviously the fact that like it's, for example, people who have certain tax liabilities that they can't like face, or for example people who don't have like registered income, or people who don't have the right kind of bank account. I don't have the right kind of bank account, so I have to like buy the dollars in the financial market.
Mm-hmm.
But like you don't pay like that much for premium. You pay like when Milei took office, the official exchange rate was right before he took office. Sorry, or something. The exchange rate was 400 in the official market, and in the parallel market it was over 1,000. And now it's like 1,500 and 1,550. So it's sort of like there's been a bit of like a disconnect, but it's come from like to a little bit. So that created a big economic distortion because people didn't want to sell their dollars to the government. They wanted to sell them to the informal market. And so that meant that like the people who had dollars and wanted to sell them weren't like putting them into the financial system. They were putting them into like boxes in their house. And I went from saving my money in dollar bills in cash to saving my money in my bank account.
Mm-hmm.
Even that, so like I can pay the transaction charges with them.
Yeah. And so now, with the currency, the different exchange rates starting to come together a bit, not quite perfect, but it seems like there's been more interest in international travelers coming to places like Buenos Aires. How would you say that's affecting things economically?
Well, I mean, there's always a backlash to these sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, Mexico City,
Mm-hmm.
for example, was like a big, digital nomad, sort of like a very international city. And 3-4 years ago, people were ecstatic. They were like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, this is gonna bring jobs, this is gonna bring investment, this is gonna bring like tourists that have a lot of money. Now they're like, we don't want them here,
Mm-hmm.
because they started opening bars and coffee shops and businesses that cater to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of like rubbed some of the locals the wrong way. But like this is in the very early stages here,
Mm-hmm.
because like I think people here, and especially online, there's a lot more interest, and there's a lot of like discussion of the city in I think one of the big, like it's sort of like a chicken and egg situation where there's like more discussion, and
Mm-hmm.
then like there's conferences being held. There was a tech conference held last month. There's like celebrities visiting, like they come to do a tour and then they like hang around the city and go to famous bars and go to famous restaurants and whatever. That sort of like puts the city on the map a lot, but it has to be like on the map first. Like if you compare how they post out Rio or Santiago de Chile or Bogota with how they post out here, it's like different enough that you notice that they're like out and about much more. And so maybe like the city is going to start like being internationally recognized and internationally cool. Like Mexico City had that process, and the one I'm really familiar with is Berlin, which was sort of like very post-industrial in the 90s, and that meant that it was really cheap because there was a lot of like massive abandoned buildings from the communist government. And so that meant that like a lot of people, and because of like the history of Berlin in arts, and especially that like people in Berlin didn't have to do the military draft, so a lot of people who didn't want to go into the military like moved to Berlin specifically. So it was very artistic and independent and countercultural. So that meant that like by the 2000s it was very, very, like by the 2000s it was like doing better economically, but it was still like relatively cheap because of all the empty buildings. And it was also like pretty quote unquote cool and and artistic and everything. So it became like a really big like let's go live there for 3 months thing, like for international travelers. So, and Mexico City now is having the same thing where people who can work from home go live there because it's cheaper, but it's also like got a lot of art and a lot of like culture and design because it's historically been the capital of Mexican culture. And well, I mean, and in the past it also was a very violent city. So it was very like, there was a lot of crime. There were a lot of like kidnappings of foreigners. My uncle used to live in Mexico in the 90s, and he told me it was pretty rough.
I
He
mean,
moved to Brazil.
I had had the chance to visit in 2010, 2017, and then over the last few years have visited more frequently. And even just from 2017 to the last few years has been a dramatic change. In 2017, I was stuck in traffic heading to a corporate office for a work trip, and there were cops on the overpasses. And now that's just not even a thing anymore. The level of organized crime that was happening even then has significantly declined and made the city much more desirable to visit.
Yeah, safer. The city, like from what I gather, has been like governed really well over the last sort of decade, and I think that's really helped the current president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, was like the mayor of Mexico City for a really long time. So I think that sort of like helped her image and helped her, win with such a big majority that she really did like solve or at least address the crime issue in Mexico because it was like seen as a really unsafe city. I mean, I hear like people who have been there or people who know the city or whatever. Like my ex-girlfriend used to have she has family there, and she told me, like it used to be really unsafe, but now it's really, really chill and really safe, and it's like not really much of a problem. And my parents still have the impression that it's the city from Man on Fire. No, was it Man on Fire? Well, with Denzel Washington and Dakota Fanning.
Okay.
Like that movie.
Yeah. It's a different. That movie was during the whole era of the yellow tint over films when taking place in Mexico, which people criticize highly these days. So it's definitely it's funny because my introduction during that era, I'm watching Quran films, because I studied in Mexico briefly to learn Spanish. And, it's just it was so stark, the difference between, what was in popular American media and what was, being made in Mexico. And just, really surprising there. And so.
Yeah, but I feel like the city here in Buenos Aires, I feel like Americans, especially Americans who are like more urban, more like minded, to like going on public transportation
Mm-hmm.
and participating in all of these like cultural institutions. I think, and dining well, etc. I think they'd really like it. Most people who visit really like the city that I know.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that goes for much of Latin America in terms of a lot of Americans, in the US were interested in being in places that are walkable, that have good public transportation, or at least inexpensive transport options in an absence of public transportation. And those are highly abundant in Latin America. It's, the mid-century decline of cities that happened in the U.S. didn't really happen in most of Latin America. And so you have more European, or European equivalent city planning and city styling, plus public transport infrastructure that I think matches what people are trying to accomplish in coastal cities and other big cities in the U.S. But the U.S., those cities have just gotten so expensive. It's just you can't really live a 90s style bohemian lifestyle outside of a few smaller cities.
Yeah, something I don't really consider it like a correction. I consider it like some more of a caveat, which is that I wouldn't be like so sure that Latin America has better urban planning because a lot of Latin American cities and like governments consider it very like aspirational that people can live a car-centric lifestyle. So some cities have really good urban planning. Colombian cities have really good urban planning. Buenos Aires, it's been like a bit all over the place, but it has generally a good urban planning. I think Rio and some other Brazilian cities are doing really well too. But Mexico City too. But like for example, Peru and Santiago de Chile are like really, really car centric. They have a lot of sprawl, and a lot of that has to do with like the fact that that you need a lot of capacity and a lot of funding to build all of these like mass transit, subways, trains, buses, etc. So that's a major limiting factor. In Buenos Aires, we're having like a lot of traffic from outside Buenos Aires, like coming in, and that's because there hasn't really been like enough not enough housing built within the city, but also not enough like transportation infrastructure. So the city government now wants to build a monorail connecting like the city to the suburbs, which everyone is making fun of that because of the Simpsons episode.
Yes, exactly.
But also like it like besides like the meme aspect and the fact that it's probably never going to happen because the city government always announces like we are going to build some crazy train, and then they like never do much. There's supposed to be a new subway line built. And I used to be really, really skeptical that it would happen, and now it's like, yeah, I think it's gonna happen. Or like they're gonna try to make it happen. But it's sort of like, it's not really like in the US where people just like have these ideas about urban planning that make it really difficult to build like mass transit infrastructure. It's like there isn't money to build it, or there hasn't been money to build it until really recently.
In the U.S., it's a will problem, not a money problem, and in many parts of Latin America, it's not a will problem; it's a money problem. So you have the willingness to do these projects, but not necessarily the resources to do so. So kind of. We've talked about a lot of things about Argentina and Buenos Aires that can be seen in kind of a critical or negative light. Being someone who's from Argentina, what would you say are some of the things that you enjoy about Buenos Aires and enjoy about Argentina?
Well, number one, I've already mentioned it, but the city has a really good cultural scene. It has like all of these really good urban practices. It has all of these really good sort of like spaces and places to eat, coffee shops, etc. Like it's a very livable city if you're like more of an urban bohemian type, so to speak. And I think the country gets a lot of things right. I mean, like the culture, people describe it as, they say that Americans are like a peach because it's really easy to get in, but it's really hard to get close. And they say that Argentinians are like a coconut because it's really hard to get in, but it's really easy to get close. So that's sort of like, so I think that people here are like very, well, they're very cold at first, but they're very, it's very easy to get close with someone and make friends and be friends with them. And it's really easy to sort of like find things to do and sort of get those things, which I already mentioned, I think. But like, it's just like, they used to say that it was like a city that never slept, sort of like New York. Now it's a bit less so, but it's still reasonably true that you can do things. And I really like that the country is very like committed to sort of like universal education. I mean, it's not really true in practice that like everyone can get the education they want, but it's at least like true in principle that you can go to public university, not pay a cent, and get your degree in a really long time because you work 8 hours a day and you have to feed your children or whatever. That makes it sort of like, it's very, I'm not gonna say it's very like egalitarian, but it's very like committed to this sort of like universal conception of public services that I think is really worth.
Yeah, and
highlighting.
it matches a lot of the worldwide standards in that regard. The U.S. is very unique in when it comes to education, higher education, and healthcare, and it creates a lot of drag, economically and socially, I think. But yeah. So
Yeah.
overall, looking forward in kind of your creative endeavors, what are you seeing?
Well, I mean, I'm gonna try to do some more like writing outside my blog. I've had some stuff like lined up, and I'm always excited to do some writing in Spanish. I don't write in Spanish in my own blog, and I always felt like I could do that like a bit more. And I also want to like do some. Well, I'm always excited to be like here on podcasts and everything. I'm working on some stuff like that's a bit broader in terms of like higher level, concepts, so to say. But which I'm excited about it, and I'm starting to think about like sort of figuring out a model to make it work as like a paid versus unpaid like tiers. I feel like that could be, workable next year. I think I have a big enough subscriber base to make it worth it. I mean, I don't really know like what number of people you should have, and obviously I'm not gonna say like, oh, I'm gonna have like 1,000 followers. If I have like 1,000 free subscribers, I'm gonna get 1,000 paid subscribers, and I'm gonna like live off that because I don't think I can. But I'm gonna say like maybe I can get a few hundred and start like growing from that number. Because I'm not really sure if I want to like write full time or whatever, but I also feel like it could be worth exploring as like something I can start getting towards. I mean, I'm thinking about it obviously, and I have my job and I'm doing a master's, so I don't really have like the time to be able to have a second job, quote unquote. But it's going to be like something that I take seriously next year, and that I take seriously in the short to medium term. And like, yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm doing really well creatively. There used to be like a really long time where I felt like I couldn't write anything, or not really I couldn't write anything. I just had like a really hard time sort of coming up with ideas. And when that happens, that's why I mentioned the reading thing, because when that happens, I usually try to like read papers and talk about them. So that made it like easier for me to get something done, even if it was like kind of boring and very like narrow in scope. And like inspiration sort of comes and goes a bit. Like not, but like, and that's also like a big reason why I don't really want to like, I don't really want to like enable paid subscriptions without figuring out like a value model first, because I feel like my value proposition right now is compatible with me, for example, taking time off for exams, taking time off because I'm busy or because I have like a lot of personal commitments and can't make time to write or to figure stuff out. So that's sort of like, so when I see that, I'm like, yeah, I mean, maybe this wouldn't really like be possible if this was my source of income. But also I have the impression that if I did that, I would have like a lot more time to myself and for anything. So that's why I want to like take the idea seriously, but not necessarily like do it. Like I want to see whether I think I could like offer something that's worth paying for without it being like more than I can actually offer in terms of a time commitment. That's it's not really that I don't think my writing is worth paying for. I mean, some people have paid for it. It's that I think that like if you're someone who subscribes to a blog, you have like an expectation that someone will publish with some regularity and that they will publish like with the quality and sort of depth that you're paying for. And I get the impression that that might be hard if I'm like, you know, more independent in my personal life, which I am. Obviously, like I know that there's like writers who say, "Oh, I'm going on vacation," and they don't publish for 2 weeks or for a month or whatever, or I'm not publishing for the holidays, and that's perfectly fine. Like that's not really what I mean. It's like I don't know. I'm getting my master's right now, and this weekend I might not make it to write something for the end of the week, and I have been really busy this last month, so it's been like really hard making time to write. So it's like, yeah, I mean, and I don't really feel guilty or like feel like I'm letting anyone down for finishing something for a week, because in the end of the day I'm doing it for myself, and if you start getting paid for something, you are doing it for the person who's paying you. And that's also why I don't like the side gig and side hustle culture, because you know you're turning an activity that you could do for yourself into an activity that you do for money, and that sort of changes your relationship to what you're doing and makes it, you know, not very, I'm not gonna say not very honest, but not very authentic, because something I don't like is figuring out what people think of me. I think that's sort of like irrelevant. I mean, if they're reading what I said, I don't care if they like it or not. So I can like say my actual opinion about something. I can say, no, I think that it's like stupid to try to focus on people having more money to spend instead of like having better high quality of life or whatever. And so, and like maybe if you are getting paid money, you don't want to say things that piss people off, because you're like, oh no, they're gonna be, you know, be mad at what I said and stop paying. And if that's your livelihood, that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, it's been great to have you on, Maya. Where can the viewers find you online?
Well, they can find me on Substack, obviously. They can find me on Twitter, and they can find me on Blue Sky, and, you know, occasionally on TikTok, but I don't post there very often, and I don't post anything seriously. I did consider going on TikTok once, but I didn't think I could pull it off. So
yeah, it's a complex platform. I've tried myself, but it can be challenging at times. But really appreciate having you on, and wishing the best on your future endeavors.
Thank you. Well, I wish the best for you too.